Continuing with the Meyer book, we go back to chapter 9. I'm sorry, chapter 9 that begins with the title "Compromat," and this begins a discussion in March of 1999 when the famous video uh, appears of two young women who were known to be prostitutes and tied in with a criminal gangs. Uh, are filmed being in bed with a man who looks very much like the prosecutor general Yuri Sorkatov. And remember, this is 1999. Yeltsin is still president. Putin is prime minister, and Sorkatov is going after Yeltsin's family and the people around him for corruption, particularly tied into the so-called Kremlin Gate, the scandal associated with the renovation of the Kremlin palaces and buildings. And so this talks about how Putin apparently gets involved, and they produce this video and use it to blackmail and pressure Yuri Sakharov to resign, and eventually he's forced out of his position as Procurator General, and the investigation kind of disappears. And so anytime you see the word family capitalized or capitalized with quotes around it, that's talking about Putin's, not his personal family, but that Yeltsin's personal family, but his extended political family, the people around him who are involved. Um, the chapter also talks about Chechnya and the problems there, the growing difficulty between the United States and Russia. Talks about an interesting event, and that really is something I talk more about in my foreign policy class. Uh, but it is about when NATO and Russian peacekeepers were involved in a potential clash uh, over the Pristina airport in the former Yugoslavia, and the Russian peacekeepers rushed to this airport to take control of it, and this was against NATO's orders. They were supposedly under NATO command. The American general in charge ordered the British troops that were surrounding the airport to fire on the Russians. The British general said, "I'm not going to start World War III here," and eventually things calmed down and that, and there was a settlement to it, but it was a potentially very explosive event. Um, it goes on, the chapter talking about the situation in Chechnya, how the first war in Chechnya had been unpopular. We talked about that, how brutal it was suppressed, and lots of, because there was more freedom of the press during the Yeltsin era, there were a lot of opposition newspapers to Yeltsin that were talking about these horrible things that were happening there. So it was a real problem. Chapter 10, again, what's the title? In the Outhouse. How many chapters in a scholarly book have you read that begins in the outhouse? What does this refer to? This refers to Putin's famous line that he would hunt down the Chechen terrorists and take care of them even if they were in the outhouse, even if they were in a toilet. He would go in. Now, he used much more vulgar language than that. And this is part of the image that the so-called Project Putin, to put Putin in the forefront, to make him a strong, dynamic person who can take charge of Russia. Um, this talks about the apartment bombings in September and October that are the pretext for the intervention, for the start of the Second Chechen War. It raises questions about the involvement of the security services, particularly in the incident in Ryazan, Ryazan, where an old man looks out his window at night because old men have trouble sleeping often, and he sees men carrying what look to be huge bags into his building. He um, he calls the police. He says, "This doesn't look right." The police come. They find what appears to be a fertilizer bomb in the basement of this building. They send out Points Mullen to arrest uh, anyone who was in this particular car. They've got the license plate of the car. Turns out the car is licensed to the FSB, the security services. There are FSB agents in it. They're arrested. They are um, accused of attempted murder. And it's all covered up because the FSB claims that this was just a practice. They were testing, and that the bags were not fertilizer, that they were, I think, sugar or salt or something like that. And this has not been proven, but there is enough circumstantial evidence that it appears um, that this may have been the pretext to help, boost this image of of Putin in Russia, turning the long animosity towards the Chechen people, inflaming it, and using it to shore up Putin's position as a potential uh, president. Because, at the end of the year, Yeltsin resigns, and Putin, as prime minister, becomes acting president. And because he's acting president, because there's a resignation, there has to be an earlier election for the presidency, and Putin um, is carrying a very aggressive war against the Chechens. One of the first duties um, as president, as acting president, is he flies to Chechnya and passes out lots of medals to the Russian soldiers who are involved there. It also talks about the uh, the, the campaign or the efforts of Primakov, the former prime minister, and Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow, to put together a political party, Fatherland All Russia, a combination party. And it looks like that Lushkov and Primakov are positioning this party to take a run for the presidency in 2000. Probably Primakov, because he's got a wider reputation, he would be the presidential candidate. And this chapter also talks about the creation of the party unity, where Boris Berezovsky, the godfather of the Kremlin, the close personal friend of uh, President Yeltsin, helps to create overnight this party that has no real platform, and people start joining it because it is associated with the government. It is, quote, another party of power. But remember, we've seen in past presidential elections in Russia the so-called party of power not being that powerful in terms of electoral support. But things will change with this, and largely because of uh, the war in Chechnya, and the fact that Putin uh, becomes the nominee of this new party unity, and he is so different than the frail, elderly Yeltsin that he rallies support. And of course, the Duma elections in 1999 still show the communists as the strongest party in Russia in terms of electoral support, and that's discussed on page 167, with the communists getting 24%, this new party unity coming in, doing surprisingly well, 23%. The Lushkov-Primakov alliance, Fatherland or Russia, that looked to be a strong candidate, comes in at only 13%. And part of the reason that the Lushkov-Primakov alliance didn't do as well goes back to the title of chapter 9, the preceding chapter, Compromise. Because during this campaign in the Duma in late 1999, the government launched all sorts of stories. The papers that were under the control of the Yeltsin government and the media's TV stations broadcast all these stories of corruption and double dealing, particularly about Lushkov, but they also painted some against Primakov, particularly with Primakov saying, he's just a stalking horse for the communists. If Primakov comes, the communists are going to use him to come back into power, because Primakov had a good relation and had been a long time member of the Communist Party. So this compromise campaign really helped to squelch the possibility of this Primakov-Lushkov alliance being able to pick the next president. And so you see how this fits in here. Um, and let's see if there's anything else in the chapter I want to call your attention to. Oh, yes, certainly. At the end of the chapter, when Yeltsin steps down as president, this chapter talks about how one of the first acts that the new acting president, Vladimir Putin, does is to issue an agreement, an order that gives President Yeltsin and his political family, his personal family, immunity from prosecution. So that if um, any investigator comes up with evidence of corruption regarding the Yeltsin personal family, they will be exempt from any kind of prosecution. So, you know, is this the quid pro quo that was involved in the selection of Putin as the next president? Because how does Putin become president? He's pushed up by uh, President Yeltsin. He's picked as his prime minister. Yeltsin resigns, admits that he's not done his perfect job, and turns the reins of power over to this new, younger, more dynamic person, Vladimir Putin. All right, chapter 11 begins 2000, and here we are now going to be talking about the real Putin years when he puts his stamp on the country. It talks about the fact that this largely unknown individual puts together, again, people around him put together a so-called his electoral manifesto titled Russia at the Turn of the Millennium. And when you read this, and you can, it's online, you can find it in English, it really you really see that sense that he talks about the need to strengthen national unity, to re-encourage patriotism, how he is committed to a strong central government, that he is going to treat all people alike. Um, he sees a new Russia emerging, stronger, that can take its place back among the world's great powers. Um, he is going to restore this state to its power, and that's his pledge. And that certainly is one electoral pledge that he has carried out. Um, let's see, what else is there in this chapter that we want to talk about? There's an interesting phrase, not seen it anywhere else, on page 183, videocracy. Take a look at that, see what you think of that. And I think this talks about the electoral campaign for the president in the year 2000, and how the media just was full of these stories about Putin going to Chechnya, doing all these wonderful things, how active he was, how he played hockey, how he was expert at judo, a black belt in judo. And this is painting this picture of this strong candidate, a new type of president, not an old man who's frail, and not a drunkard, not an individual with health problems, painting this image that is going to help him. And of course, we know the results of the March election in 2000 is Putin being elected president in his own right without having to run a second round. He wins the presidency in the first round and starts off. Um, it He does raise in there a question about. He talks about an enduring mystery that would shadow Russia for years and that did not stop claiming lives. Think back about that. What would be this mystery with the rise of Putin? See if you can answer that question, because I think that might be one you'd see again. All right. moving on, how he is adjusting to the role of president, how he is struggling, bringing in people. It talks about on 192, people close to him, people he's bringing into the government. Talks about the Petersburg Clan. These are people that Putin has worked with either in the government of St. Petersburg when he came back from East Germany, or people he's known there, the people around the Ozero Dasha community cooperative. And you see these names, and you're going to have to know some of these names. Ivanov and Kudrin and Kolochev. You'll see these names, and you need to know who they are and why they are related to that. And one of the things that can become evident very soon in his presidency is, in some ways, Putin has, despite this macho image, has a very thin skin. Because there was a very famous television program in Russia called Kukli. And Kukli would, they created puppets that looked very much like candidate individuals who are in politics and in the media and in the news in Russia, usually with exaggerated features. Um, but these puppets would take sometimes ridiculous positions. Sometimes they would actually speak the words of these candidates. But when you heard them, you'd say, "I got to." Well, they say that. Did he really mean that? And they use it to poke fun at the powerful, the pompous, the wealthy, and the president. And Putin was not happy that the president was being insulted, that he was being insulted, and it talks about how he put pressure on, and eventually this program disappeared from television. You can still see, I think, this thin skin, even as recently as 2018, when they pass a law that raises pretty substantial penalties if you insult the government, if you insult governmental leaders. Now, we in the United States have a concept of free press and fairly uh, liberal laws that mean that you can poke fun, ridicule elected officials, important officials. That's part of the nature of our democracy, but that's not the kind of democracy that Putin wants to have in Russia. And so, again, you see how so much of his personal beliefs and values, characteristics of Putin turn out to be the characteristics of the government. But moving on, in the same chapter, it talks about the disaster of the Kursk, this Russian submarine in the Arctic that is sunk, and and it shows how Putin is adjusting to the public life of a president. Because when this ship went down, he was on vacation. And, if an American submarine disappeared with a number of, full crew on board, um, American president would be on television, expressing his concern and saying that the Navy is going to do everything it can to rescue these people. And Putin is off, playing golf down the Crimea or Sochi. I forget which one of his resorts or which one of his presidential retreats he was at. But the press hammered him, particularly um, the press of Guzinski and Berezovsky, these close allies, oligarchs that were close to Yeltsin. Putin has been distancing himself from the oligarchs. And you'll remember very early in his presidency, he has a meeting with the oligarchs, and it's discussed in the Myers book, where he says basically, stay out of politics, and we will not discuss uh, reassessing the privatization. In other words, you've got all this money and wealth and property and assets that you've acquired as a result of corrupt privatization, but we're not going to discuss that if you stay out of politics. And uh, Putin is particularly embarrassed when he eventually does come back under pressure and meets with the families of these sailors that have died, and he starts giving political excuses. It wasn't our fault. Blah blah blah. He blames the Americans, and the families start screaming at him. You're lying. Tell us the truth. What happened to our relatives? Lying, lying, lying. Well, this is really unacceptable to Putin. He's very uh, upset by this, very disturbed by this. He does not want to be accused and criticized. And here it is, even the Russian people doing this. And this, so you can see he's still very new into the presidency, and this powerful image and this powerful supporting cast around him is going to grow and strengthen that wall between him and the Russian people, where it is always Putin the strong man, Putin doing everything right, never admitting to any mistakes. Um, it's like someone else we know in the presidency. Um, so here we now move to chapter 12, around 203, Putin's soul. So what does this talk about? This is going to refer to the relationship that's going to develop with Vladimir Putin and the new American president, George Bush. This is going to talk about the case where uh, Putin met Bush in Slovenia and supposedly looked into his eyes and looked into it and saw his soul and said, "This is a man that uh, is warm and we can have relationships and we can improve the Russian-American relations." Although, interestingly enough, the future American and a future American ambassador to Moscow, the political scientist Michael McFaul, at the time, probably shouldn't have said this, but who knew he was going to be an ambassador at the time. He says that as a result of this meeting in Slovenia, that Putin is a trained KGB officer, and the KGB trained their officers to lie. And if you go back and you think about the role of Putin in Eastern Europe. He was not a James Bond uh, carrying a whatever James Bond gun and shooting people and doing that. Oh, he likes to project this image as a tough guy. Basically, he was the kind of a spy who sits back and gets to meet people and tries to worm his way into their confidence, talk about needs and interests and what can he do to help, tries to be a good guy to them, to get them to trust him, and so that he can get information from them. And this ability to manipulate people is really important, and I think it's something that Putin has used to very good effect as president of Russia. It also talks about some of the little things that he was doing to try to shore up his position. Talks 208 talks about the national anthem, how nobody knew the national anthem that the Yeltsin administration put in. So Putin's people come up with this idea: let's take the music of the old Soviet national anthem and let's put some new words to it. And people loved that. They could sing the song. They liked that. Um, so here's Putin trying to take a new non-communist, non-Soviet position, but also to bring the people along with him. The chapter talks about that. A lot of it is one of the discussions of Putin and Bush and the building this friendship, because I really do think that Putin thought that he and Bush, particularly after 9/11, and that Putin was the first president to get through to Bush to pledge his support. And in fact, our war against the Taliban could not have been as successful if it wasn't for the Russian military intelligence, the right to fly over Russian territory, the using of bases. Russia put pressure on the Central Asian republics so that we were able to have bases in several of those countries to resupply our forces in Afghanistan. All of that was very useful. The chapter also talks about the ways that Putin is going about in that first administration, his first years in office, as trying to take control of the country. It talks about his efforts to rein in these governors around the country in the 89 units of the Russian Federation, how he appoints presidential envoys to 7 districts. These districts also follow exactly along the way the Ministry of Defense had divided the country into regions. So there are 7 military districts in Russia at the time, and 7 presidential envoys to these regions, where they are going to be the president's man, and they were all men, and most of them came out of the force services, the Silovoki, either from the KGB or the military. All right, and talks about that. Also talks in that chapter about the rise of this United Russia, which is a blend with the remnants of the All Russia, Fatherland All Russia Party that was attacked by Unity, and primarily Unity, but Unity absorbing the party of Primakov and Lyshkov, that really becomes the party of power, and we call now United Russia in there. Also, it talks about the budding relationship between Vladimir Putin and Ahmed Kadyrov in Chechnya, how while he had originally been strong opponent of the Russian effort to reconquer Chechnya, he eventually um, decided to work with the Russians, became the leader of Chechnya. Eventually, he was assassinated because there were many Chechens who didn't want to work with the Russians, and so they were keeping up this war. And Kadyrov's son eventually becomes a very close friend of Putin's, and is the current president of the Chechen Republic, which is in the Russian Federation. All right. Uh, Also in here, it talks about the theater siege in Moscow, which I have discussed. It talks about Shamil Basayev, who is the leader of the Chechen resistance, fighting against the Russians. Talks about the use of the so-called Black Widows. These are women uh, whose husbands have died in the war against Russia, and Basayev and others have used these people to smuggle bombs into metros, trains, several rock concerts, etc. And women were a part of the terrorists that took over the Moscow theater, and so um, I think I'll stop there. That's the end of chapter 12, and the next video will cover chapter 13, which has the interesting title, and you should know what this refers to: the gods slept on their heads. That's a Russian phrase. You need to understand that if you're going to understand what this chapter 13 is about, and I'll talk more about that in the next video. All right, so that'll do it for now.